They expected untreated wounds, ignored pain, and slow decline behind barbed wire. But instead, German prisoners of war were led into American military hospitals, examined by U.S. Army doctors, and given medicine and care that many of them never expected to receive from an enemy. For German prisoners of war, captivity in America was imagined as a place where injuries would worsen and illness would be endured in silence, because that was how enemy prisons had been described to them throughout the war. Many arrived already weakened by combat, exposure, and exhaustion, carrying wounds that had been treated poorly or not at all during retreat and capture. What they encountered inside American prison camps challenged those expectations immediately. Instead of neglect, prisoners were examined, their conditions recorded, and their injuries treated within organized medical facilities staffed by U.S. Army doctors. Medicine was issued, bandages were changed, and recovery was monitored with methodical precision. This care did not erase captivity, but it introduced a contradiction that unsettled many prisoners. Receiving treatment from an enemy forced them to confront a reality they had not prepared for, where survival depended not on endurance alone, but on adapting to a system that preserved them rather than discarded them. For German prisoners of war arriving in American camps, medical care began almost immediately, often before they fully understood where they were. After transport by ship and rail, many prisoners reached camp facilities physically depleted, carrying untreated wounds, infections, and illnesses that had developed during months of combat, retreat, and capture. Medical attention was not optional or selective. It was part of the intake process. Upon arrival, prisoners were directed through a series of examinations conducted by U.S. Army medical personnel. These inspections followed standardized military procedures rather than improvised decisions. Doctors and medics recorded names, ages, injuries, and general health conditions with bureaucratic precision. The atmosphere was clinical rather than confrontational, reinforcing the sense that this was a system built on routine rather than punishment. For many prisoners, the experience was disorienting. They had prepared themselves mentally for neglect, assuming that enemy captors would have little interest in preserving their health. Instead, wounds were cleaned, bandages replaced, and infections treated according to established medical protocols. Even minor injuries were noted, suggesting that long-term health mattered within the structure of the camp. The presence of organized infirmaries further challenged expectations. These facilities were not temporary shelters, but permanent medical spaces equipped with beds, supplies, and staff trained to handle a range of conditions. Prisoners with serious injuries were separated for treatment, while those suffering from illness received medication and observation rather than isolation or dismissal. Vaccinations were administered as part of broader public health measures. American authorities were concerned with preventing outbreaks that could spread rapidly within confined populations. This concern extended to prisoners as well as guards, reinforcing the idea that maintaining health served practical administrative goals rather than humanitarian gestures alone. Medical care continued beyond the initial examinations. Regular checkups were scheduled, and prisoners were required to report symptoms rather than conceal them. This expectation contrasted sharply with battlefield culture, where injuries were often ignored or minimized. In the camp environment, reporting illness became part of compliance with routine. For some prisoners, this shift required adjustment. Accepting treatment from enemy doctors conflicted with deeply ingrained beliefs shaped by propaganda and military training. Trust did not come easily, and skepticism remained common. Yet repeated exposure to consistent care gradually reduced resistance, replacing fear with cautious acceptance. The system relied on documentation. Medical records were updated regularly, tracking recovery and physical fitness. These records served multiple purposes: informing work assignments, preventing the spread of disease, and ensuring that prisoners remained physically capable throughout prolonged confinement. Health became a managed resource within the camp's administrative framework. As days passed, prisoners began to recognize that medical care was not an isolated privilege, but a fundamental component of American camp operations. The emphasis on health reinforced stability, reduced unrest, and supported a controlled environment where routines could function without disruption. This early exposure to organized medical treatment set the tone for captivity. It signaled that American camps would operate through structure and predictability rather than neglect. For German POWs, the realization that their bodies were being preserved rather than discarded introduced a new psychological challenge, one that would shape how they understood captivity in the weeks and months to come. As German prisoners of war settled into the rhythm of American camps, medical care revealed itself not as a single event tied to arrival, but as an ongoing system woven into daily life. Treatment did not end once wounds were cleaned or illnesses stabilized. Instead, health became part of a structured routine designed to preserve physical condition over long periods of confinement. Prisoners requiring continued attention were transferred to camp hospitals or infirmaries, facilities that mirrored those used by American troops. These spaces followed military standards with designated wards, scheduled rounds, and clear chains of responsibility. Doctors and medics operated according to established protocols, applying the same procedures repeatedly regardless of nationality. For many prisoners, the familiarity of military medical order contrasted sharply with their expectations of enemy neglect. Routine care included follow-up examinations, medication schedules, and observation periods. Prisoners were called in by name or identification number, reinforcing the administrative nature of treatment. Recovery was measured methodically, with progress noted and restrictions adjusted as conditions improved. This process emphasized control through documentation rather than coercion. The presence of hospitals within or near campgrounds served practical purposes. By treating injuries promptly, authorities reduced long-term disability and prevented complications that could disrupt labor assignments or camp stability. Medical care supported efficiency, ensuring that prisoners remained capable of performing assigned tasks without becoming a burden on resources. Preventive medicine played a significant role. Camps implemented hygiene standards, regular inspections, and vaccination programs to limit the spread of disease. These measures were not discretionary. They were enforced consistently, reflecting broader military concerns about outbreaks in confined populations. Prisoners learned that maintaining health was not a personal choice, but a requirement imposed by the system. For those who had experienced shortages and improvised treatment during retreat, the availability of medicine and equipment felt unreal. Supplies were stored, labeled, and issued systematically. Bandages, disinfectants, and basic pharmaceuticals were accessible, reinforcing the sense that care here was planned rather than improvised. This predictability altered how prisoners perceived risk and vulnerability. Despite this structure, emotional distance remained. Medical staff maintained professional detachment, focusing on procedures rather than personal interaction. Conversations were limited, instructions concise. This neutrality reinforced authority while avoiding overt hostility. Care was provided without reassurance or explanation beyond what was necessary, preserving order without inviting familiarity. Over time, prisoners adapted to this environment. Appointments were attended without resistance. Symptoms reported rather than hidden. Compliance replaced suspicion as the system demonstrated consistency. Trust was not built through empathy, but through repetition. The same actions, performed again and again, established reliability. This approach had psychological effects. Knowing that injuries would be treated reduced anxiety, but it also underscored captivity's permanence. Recovery no longer meant return to duty or freedom. Healing simply prepared prisoners for continued confinement. Medical care preserved the body while extending imprisonment, a reality that many found difficult to reconcile. As weeks passed, the role of hospitals and routine care became clear. They were not symbols of mercy, but components of a larger administrative strategy. Health supported order, productivity, and control. By preserving physical condition, the system ensured that captivity could continue smoothly, without crises or disruptions. For German prisoners of war, this realization marked another step in understanding American captivity. Medical care was not an exception to confinement, but an integral part of it. Through hospitals, schedules, and preventive measures, the camps demonstrated a form of control that relied on maintenance rather than neglect, shaping both bodies and expectations as time moved forward. As medical treatment became routine within American prison camps, German prisoners of war began to experience an unexpected consequence of recovery itself. Physical healing, which should have brought relief, often introduced a deeper psychological tension. Wounds closed, pain subsided, and strength slowly returned. Yet each sign of improvement reinforced the reality that captivity was not temporary, but carefully sustained. For many prisoners, illness or injury had initially provided a form of mental distance from confinement. Pain demanded attention, narrowing focus to the immediate struggle of endurance. As treatment removed these distractions, prisoners were left with greater awareness of their surroundings and their situation. Recovery returned the body to stability, but it also returned the mind to reflection. Medical supervision extended beyond treatment into daily observation. Doctors determined fitness levels, restricted movement when necessary, and authorized return to work. These decisions, made without visible hostility, reinforced authority through expertise rather than force. Control was exercised quietly, embedded within clinical judgment and routine evaluation. This system reshaped how prisoners perceive power. Orders delivered by guards could be resisted emotionally, even if obeyed physically. Medical instructions, however, carried a different weight. They were framed as necessary for health and safety, making compliance feel rational rather than imposed. The result was a form of obedience that emerged from practicality rather than fear. Healing also altered relationships among prisoners. Those recovering from serious injuries were temporarily removed from work details, creating subtle distinctions within the camp population. Illness became a condition managed by the system, not a shared hardship. As health improved, differences narrowed, reinforcing uniformity and predictability. American medical personnel rarely acknowledged the emotional impact of their work. Their role focused on maintaining physical condition, not addressing morale. Yet the psychological effects were unavoidable. Each examination, each recorded improvement, reinforced the idea that prisoners were being maintained for continuity, not prepared for release. Recovery extended captivity rather than shortening it. For prisoners who had expected neglect, this realization was unsettling. Care received from an enemy complicated narratives of victimhood and resistance. Gratitude felt inappropriate, yet suspicion diminished as treatment remained consistent. This emotional ambiguity left many prisoners uncertain how to interpret their experience. Over time, the combination of healing and routine produced resignation rather than relief. Physical well-being removed excuses for unrest. Energy returned, but purpose remained absent. The camp functioned smoothly, its medical system ensuring that bodies remained capable while time passed without clear endpoint. The quiet efficiency of care contrasted sharply with wartime medical chaos. On the battlefield, treatment was urgent and often improvised, focused on returning soldiers to combat. In captivity, treatment served a different objective. It preserved life without advancing it. Healing did not restore agency. It sustained confinement. As prisoners adjusted to this reality, medical facilities became symbols of the camp's broader philosophy. Control was not exerted through suffering, but through maintenance. The body was stabilized so that the system could endure. Health became another regulated condition within captivity, managed with the same predictability as work schedules and lights out. By this stage, German prisoners of war understood that American medical care was neither purely benevolent nor punitive. It was administrative. It reduced risk, maintained order, and ensured continuity. Healing, once a sign of progress, became a reminder that captivity was designed to last, shaping endurance not through pain, but through prolonged normalcy. As medical care became fully integrated into camp life, German prisoners of war gradually realized that treatment was only one part of a broader system of regulation. Health was not managed casually or reactively. It was monitored, recorded, and adjusted within an administrative framework that treated the prisoner population as a resource to be maintained over time. Medical records formed the backbone of this system. Each examination, diagnosis, and treatment was documented carefully, creating a continuous profile of physical condition. These records informed decisions far beyond the infirmary. Work assignments, dietary adjustments, and movement restrictions were all influenced by medical assessments, linking health directly to daily function within the camp. This bureaucratic approach reinforced authority without overt pressure. Prisoners were not ordered to comply through threats. Instead, compliance was embedded in procedure. Appointments were scheduled, attendance expected, and outcomes recorded. The predictability of this process reduced resistance, as it framed control as necessity rather than command. Regulation extended to preventive measures as well. Camps enforced hygiene standards, periodic inspections, and isolation protocols when illness appeared. These actions were presented as safeguards for the entire population, including guards. By framing restrictions as protective rather than punitive, authorities minimized conflict and encouraged cooperation. Diet and rest were adjusted according to medical recommendations. Prisoners deemed unfit for certain tasks were reassigned temporarily, while those cleared for work returned to routine. This constant evaluation reinforced the idea that physical condition determined one's place within the camp system. Health became a criterion of participation, not a personal concern. The neutrality of medical staff played a critical role. Doctors and medics rarely expressed emotion or opinion. Their focus remained on measurements, observations, and outcomes. This detachment lent legitimacy to decisions, making them appear objective and unavoidable. Authority was exercised through expertise rather than confrontation. For prisoners, adapting to this environment required a shift in mindset. The body was no longer solely their own. It was subject to oversight, assessment, and classification. Injuries and illnesses became entries in a file, influencing daily life in subtle but persistent ways. This realization deepened the sense of captivity, extending it beyond physical confinement. Over time, prisoners learned to navigate the system strategically. Some reported symptoms promptly to avoid complications, while others minimized issues to return to work and routine. These choices reflected attempts to retain a measure of agency within a regulated environment. Yet even these strategies operated within boundaries defined by medical authority. The cumulative effect of regulation and record-keeping was stability. Outbreaks were contained, injuries managed, and labor maintained. The camp functioned with minimal disruption, its systems reinforcing one another. Medical care supported order, while order ensured medical oversight remained effective. This interconnected structure revealed the underlying logic of American captivity. Preservation of health was not an act of leniency, but a component of long-term control. By maintaining bodies, authorities ensured that time, rather than crisis, defined imprisonment. By this stage, German prisoners of war understood that medical care was inseparable from regulation. Treatment, documentation, and routine formed a cohesive system designed to endure. Health was managed not to liberate, but to sustain captivity, reinforcing a form of control that operated quietly, persistently, and without spectacle. As months passed inside American prison camps, German prisoners of war began to experience the long-term consequences of sustained medical care and physical stability. Recovery became the norm rather than the exception. Wounds healed fully, illnesses were controlled, and bodies regained strength, yet this restoration carried an unexpected burden. Health no longer signaled progress toward freedom, but readiness to continue waiting. For many prisoners, improved physical condition sharpened awareness of time. Without pain or sickness to mark the days, captivity settled into a steady rhythm defined by routine and repetition. Medical care ensured that life continued smoothly, but it also removed any sense of urgency. Days followed one another without significant variation, reinforcing the reality that release depended entirely on events beyond the camp's boundaries. This prolonged waiting altered how prisoners understood survival. On the battlefield, survival meant immediate action and constant risk. In captivity, survival meant endurance through normalcy. The body was preserved, but the future remained suspended. Healing extended life within confinement rather than leading toward resolution. Psychological adjustment followed. Prisoners learned to manage expectations, focusing on maintaining balance rather than seeking change. Medical visits became routine checkpoints rather than moments of hope. Recovery no longer inspired relief. It became an obligation to continue functioning within the system. Strength returned, but direction did not. The role of medical care in this process became increasingly clear. By maintaining health, authorities removed one of the few variables that could disrupt camp operations. Illness and injury no longer threatened order. The system operated smoothly, supported by bodies capable of enduring time without crisis. For some prisoners, this realization provoked quiet resignation. Resistance offered no practical outcome, and compliance required little effort. Medical care removed extremes, narrowing experience to routine. The absence of suffering did not equate to comfort. Instead, it produced a state of prolonged suspension, where existence continued without clear purpose. Communication with the outside world remained limited. News arrived sporadically, offering glimpses of a war progressing without them. As the conflict moved toward its conclusion, prisoners understood that their health would ensure survival until release, but not influence when that release would come. The body was maintained to outlast the war, not to rejoin it. Within this context, medical care assumed symbolic significance. It represented a system that valued stability above resolution. Healing preserved life, but it also preserved confinement. The very measures that reduced suffering extended the duration of waiting. As the war's end approached, prisoners reflected on their experience with mixed emotions. Gratitude for survival coexisted with unease about how captivity had unfolded. Medical care had protected them from neglect, yet had also reinforced a form of control that operated quietly and persistently. By the final stages of confinement, German prisoners of war recognized that American medical care had shaped captivity in subtle but lasting ways. It transformed survival from a struggle against hardship into an endurance of time. Health became both a safeguard and a reminder that captivity was designed to continue calmly, steadily, and without interruption until history itself decided its end. For German prisoners of war held in the United States, medical care became one of the most unexpected elements of captivity. Instead of neglect and indifference, they encountered a system built on routine treatment, documentation, and preservation. Hospitals, doctors, and medicine were not gestures of compassion alone, but parts of an administrative structure designed to maintain stability over time. This care reshaped the experience of imprisonment. By restoring health and reducing suffering, it removed the urgency and chaos that often define survival in war. Healing brought strength, but it also extended awareness, forcing prisoners to confront captivity not as a moment of crisis, but as a prolonged state of waiting. American camps demonstrated that control did not always rely on deprivation. Through organization and predictability, authority was maintained quietly. Medical treatment preserved bodies, supported order, and ensured that confinement could continue without disruption. In this environment, endurance was measured not by resisting pain, but by living within an unchanging routine. When the war finally ended and prisoners were released, memories of captivity were shaped not only by fences and guards, but by hospital wards, medical charts, and the steady rhythm of care. For many, the lasting impression was not cruelty, but the unsettling realization that survival had been ensured by a system that preserved life while time itself delivered freedom. In the end, medical care in American POW camps revealed a form of power that operated patiently. It healed the body, stabilized the environment, and allowed captivity to endure calmly until history moved on, leaving behind a quiet lesson about how control can exist without overt suffering. If you enjoyed this documentary and want to discover more untold stories from World War II, make sure to subscribe to WW2 Chronicle Vault. Your support helps us bring history back to life, one forgotten story at a time.